The Vakrine medical suite hummed with sterile efficiency as Dr. Lyra Hahn lay motionless on the surgical platform. Her breathing was shallow, monitored by 3 separate bioscanners that pulsed with satisfied green light. The sedation had taken hold perfectly, or so the Vakrine surgeons believed. Chief Surgeon Krelthar made the first incision with practiced precision, his 4 hands moving in synchronized harmony. The human's appendix had become inflamed during the diplomatic mission, a primitive organ failure that seemed almost quaint to the advanced Vakrine. Still, they prided themselves on their medical prowess. No species under their care had ever been lost to such a simple procedure. "Vitals stable," announced the medical AI in its melodious tone. "Subject remains in optimal sedative state. Neural activity minimal." Krelthar's secondary eyes focused on the internal imaging while his primary pair guided the surgical implements. Humans were fascinating specimens, resilient yet fragile, advanced yet still burdened by evolutionary baggage. This doctor, Hahn, had impressed the Vakrine Council with her xenobiology research, becoming the first human to receive full medical privileges in their sector. The surgery proceeded without incident for 17 minutes. Then Piprax began to cry. The sound started as a distant whimper, barely audible through the suite's sound-dampening walls. In the adjacent nursery, the Vakrine cub had woken from his rest cycle, disoriented and afraid. His caretaker had stepped away for mere moments, a lapse that would have consequences no one could have predicted. Piprax's distress escalated from whimpers to full-throated wails, the kind that evolution had designed to pierce through any barrier, any defense, any attempt to ignore. The sound carried a frequency that spoke directly to the most ancient parts of the brain, the parts that responded to a child in danger. On the surgical platform, something impossible happened. Dr. Lyra Hahn's eyelids fluttered. "Impossible," Krelthar muttered, checking his readings. The sedation levels were precisely calibrated for a human of her mass. She should remain unconscious for another hour at minimum. Piprax screamed louder, a sound of pure terror and helplessness. Lyra's eyes snapped open. By the ancestors, one of the surgical assistants stumbled backward, instruments clattering. Humans weren't supposed to do this. No species could simply will themselves awake through military-grade sedatives. But Lyra Hahn wasn't fully awake in any normal sense. Her eyes were unfocused, pupils dilated, but her body had begun to move with terrifying purpose. The monitors shrieked warnings as adrenaline flooded her system in quantities that should have been physiologically impossible given the suppressants in her bloodstream. "Restrain the patient," Krelthar commanded, trying to maintain his surgical grip, even as Lyra's hand shot up and grabbed his wrist with crushing force. "Cub," Lyra slurred, her voice thick and distant but carrying absolute conviction. Cub in danger. She shouldn't have been able to speak. She shouldn't have been able to hear anything through the sedation. And she certainly shouldn't have been able to identify the species-specific distress call of a Vakrine infant she'd never even met. "There's no danger," Krelthar began. But Lyra was already pulling herself upright, her partially sutured abdomen beginning to bleed as she tore through medical restraints that were designed to hold beings twice her size. The logical part of her brain was still asleep, but something far older had awakened, something that every human carried in their genetic memory from millions of years of evolution. From nights huddled around fires when the sound of a child's cry meant the difference between species survival and extinction. Lyra stumbled off the platform, blood streaking down her hospital gown, moving on pure instinct toward the nursery. Security doors slid shut automatically, but she rammed through them with her shoulder, the impact that should have stopped her barely registering through the cocktail of adrenaline and maternal override coursing through her veins. "Stop her!" Medical staff scattered as the human lurched down the corridor, like something from their ancestral nightmares, relentless and unstoppable. She crashed through the nursery door to find Piprax alone in his crib, tiny fists waving, his lavender skin flushed dark with distress. The moment Lyra appeared, swaying and bleeding, the cub's cries changed pitch, not quite calming, but shifting to confusion. Lyra collapsed beside the crib, one hand reaching through the bars to touch Piprax's tiny grasping fingers. "Safe," she whispered, even as her eyes began to roll back. "You're safe now." Ah. By the time the medical team caught up, Piprax had quieted, clutching the human's finger. With surprising strength, Lyra had finally succumbed to the sedatives again, unconscious but somehow still maintaining that protective contact. Krelthar stood in the doorway, all four hands hanging uselessly at his sides. In 3 centuries of medical practice, he had never witnessed anything like this. "Get her back to surgery," he finally ordered. And someone explained to me how a sedated human crossed half the medical wing because a cub was crying. But no one had an explanation. The xenopsychologists would debate it for months afterward, some citing humanity's unusual pack-bonding instincts, others pointing to their species' aggressive protective responses, still others suggesting it was merely an anomaly, a statistical impossibility that meant nothing. They were all wrong, in their way. What they witnessed wasn't about human strength or stubbornness or even their well-documented inability to mind their own business. It was something far simpler and far more terrifying to the logical, ordered minds of the Vakreen. It was the sound of a child crying in the dark, and a species that had survived for millions of years by never, ever being able to ignore it. When Dr. Lyra Han finally woke hours later, properly sutured and monitored, she had no memory of her mid-surgery awakening. But when they told her what she'd done, she simply nodded, as if it made perfect sense. "Of course I did," she said quietly, looking toward the nursery, where Piprax slept peacefully. What else would anyone do? And that, the Vakreen realized with growing unease, was perhaps the most human thing of all, that she genuinely couldn't understand why they found her actions remarkable. They added a new note to humanity's file that day. Maternal override protocols appear to supersede all known sedation methods. Recommend never conducting surgery within auditory range of distressed offspring. Species classification remains dangerous, unpredictable, indispensable.